Welcome back to Our World with Black Enterprise. We're here with an expert panel and we're discussing the issue of what does it mean to be black in the 21st century. Now, before we broke, Touré had made a point about blackness being something that's far more difficult to get our arms around now, and that he argued that to some extent, the only thing we have is this common experience of racism is what binds us. What do you say?
I want to just make really two points really quickly. One is that we have to be very careful with certain kinds of utterances in ordinary speech. Right, when they say that's not black, oftentimes, at least from my experience, when somebody says black people don't skydive, that's more about white people than black people.
What do you mean? Because to be clear, Touré says that Touré opens his book with this idea about
what I mean by that is that
skydiving.
it's like black people going to the movies, and when they see a white person go into the house, and all of a sudden, black people don't go into the house.
Right.
That's not a narrow view of blackness. That is more a commentary about white people and their willingness to risk and all this other stuff, right? So that's one thing. Also, there's a way in which blackness can also be a proxy for certain kinds of class conversations as well, right? So what we have to do is unpack these claims. But I want to say this about blackness as a way of registering a certain set of values, a certain set of obligations that follow from my identification with the freedom struggle. And that freedom struggle orients me to the world in a particular sort of way that I've chosen to embrace. When we look at the long-term trends of Black America, 35% of our children are in poverty. When we think about the rate of obesity, when we think about rates of incarceration, when we think about what's happening in education, when we think about over 40%, I think it's like 42% now of teenagers between the ages of 16 and 19 are unemployed. It's been hovering near 50% prior to that. We have a generation of young people who are not being socialized into work. So when you look at the long-term trends, how might those values that I identify with orient me to these babies? In other words, how might I invoke James Baldwin's act of piety? My task is to raise the babies. Now, what does that mean? Now, that's not about blackness. That's not about narrowing who you are. That's not about, shall we say, clipping my individualistic wings. That's about being committed to people who are caught in hell, who are catching hell. And how does that evidence itself in how I orient myself to the world? And it seems to me when we get to that discussion, then we're standing in the best of the Black freedom tradition.
Final thought, 20 years from now, when we're talking about race, if we're talking about race, how will the notion of blackness be imagined then? Let me start with you, Touré.
I would partly say that I have no idea, because there is a sort of dynamic change in the way that America is dealing with race. I am certain that we will still be talking about race, that race is not going anywhere anytime soon, and I really wish we could destroy the word post-racial, because it just clouds the discussion about race for anybody in the discussion to think, well, race doesn't matter anymore. We're in a post-racial America. That's ridiculous.
Amani, what do you say? Will we be even having this conversation in 20 years?
We will definitely be having this conversation. We're going to be trying to figure out how to rebuild stability in our communities. What little we had that's been lost as a function of this economic crisis. And we're also going to be trying to figure out how do we create terms for identifying who is within a community that cares about the well-being of our community, because we can no longer simply depend upon the color of someone's skin as a judge, as a basis for assessing what that is. So there are going to be new terms that we develop for thinking about membership.
Eddie, what do you say?
That I think we're going to be paying the price for what we see occurring or taking place right now. So the conversation is going to be intense. It may be volatile. I think race will return as the repressed in our public conversation in very powerful ways. And part of the work we need to be doing, and part of the work you're doing with your show, and Touré is doing with the work that he's doing, and Professor Perry's doing with the work that she's doing, is trying to create the space so that we can emphasize process. So that we can affirm a democratic and deliberative space for Black people without burden to debate the issues that confront them. And if we can educate a generation in that mode, then when the problems show up 20 years from now, we'll be ready to handle it.
Well, I think you all have modeled this idea of democratic dialogue and engagement in the best way imaginable. I thank you all so much for being here. Eddie Glaude, Imani Perry, Touré, thank you, thank you, thank you. Stay right there, we'll be right back. Promotional consideration brought to you by